and welcome to the Ghosts and Folklore podcast. I'm Mark Rees, and on each episode, I investigate a different, weird, and wonderful subject. And on this episode, this Halloween Nos Calan Gaeaf episode, we are going to go behind the scenes at one of Wales's, if not the world's, most famous, supposedly haunted places, and that is Margam Castle in Margam Park, Port Talbot, the scene of ghostly monks, spectral children, an angry spirit with a tragic past, and much, much more. And so, to begin at the beginning, and of all of the places I've spoken about on this podcast, Margam Park is probably the one I know best. It's certainly one of my favourites. I grew up just a few minutes away down the road. I even worked there briefly in my younger years. And the reason I've waited all these years to dedicate an episode to it is that it just seemed a little bit too obvious. I like to talk about the obscure stories, the lesser-known tales, and Margam Park and Margam Castle really are world famous. The castle has featured on all of the big ghost hunting TV shows, on Most Haunted here in the UK, on Ghost Hunters and other shows in America and around the world. And if you were to ask me to name the 5 most famous supposedly haunted places in Wales, or the top 3 even, they would be the Sgurydin in Monmouthshire, Nos Castle in the Swansea Valley, and Margam Castle in Port Talbot. These are the 3 places that everyone heads to first. Not necessarily the best, although I do really love Nos Castle, but they are 3 places that everyone talks about and everyone goes to. And so I haven't tackled them until now, but I've decided on this episode we are going to look at one of the big 3. And why, I can hear you ask, have I changed my approach for this episode? Well, there's 2 reasons really. Firstly, Margam Park has just launched a new Halloween Fright Nights event, and I was involved with that beforehand. I helped out with some ghost stories and things for press and publicity. And last week, a day before it opened to the general public, I popped along to the press night, and in fairness, I thought it was excellent. There were ghosts and vampires and zombies and all kinds of supernatural creatures all over the place, hiding behind trees and hiding behind doors and things. And I'll talk a bit more about that at the end of the episode, but I have uploaded a video of my experience to my YouTube channel, so if you'd like to see, not hear, but see what went on, you can pop over to YouTube and have a look at that. And the second reason, which is much more boring, so I'll get this out of the way nice and quickly, but I am doing some research at the moment into the Gothic, and one of my case studies is Margam Castle, so I've been spending a heck of a lot of time hanging around the place, and I thought this would be a good time to record a podcast episode about it. Now, before we dive into those spine-chilling ghost stories, and there are many of them, I should probably set the scene, because Margam really is a very, very atmospheric place. You might notice on this episode that I do switch between Margam Castle and Margam Park when I'm talking about it. They are effectively the same place. They are interchangeable. That's what all us local people in Port Talbot do anyway. Park, castle, all the same thing. But technically, Margam Castle is the big mansion house at the centre of the park. The park itself is a sprawling, vast, deer-filled nature reserve. And there are lakes there and animals and trees and forestry, and it can feel a little bit medieval at times. I mean, it's not. It's Victorian, but it captures that medievalism that was in the air at the time. This big, fancy, Gothic mansion for the rich people to live in, surrounded by lots and lots of land that was perfect for them to go hunting in, and nowadays it's perfect for us to go ghost hunting in, which is much more humane than deer hunting, and it's also ideal for Halloween events. Now, even if you've never heard of Margam Park before today, there's a good chance you might have seen it on film or on TV. It's often used as a setting. I know in recent times the Netflix folk horror film Apostle, starring Michael Sheen, filmed large parts on the ground. If you've seen it, that's where the village is set, and lots of the popular made in Wales things like Doctor Who have used it, and one of the longest running and one of the most important really was Da Vinci's Demons, if you remember that one, going back about 10 years now. Da Vinci's Demons, and the really great thing about Da Vinci's Demons filming there is that they left a lot of the scenery behind upstairs, which is, it's slightly out of view of the public, but if you get a chance to go up there, you'll see this wonderful mix of British Gothic architecture. It was built in Victorian times in the Gothic revival style, but now there's all this Italian Renaissance architecture that's been left behind from the filming of Da Vinci's Demons. And if you're wondering how you can tell them apart, which bits are original Gothic, which bits are later Renaissance style additions, well, just try tapping them, because the original Gothic bits are made from stone, all of the Italian bits are painted pieces of styrofoam or whatever it is they use to make scenery for these shows. But by far the most famous film character associated with Margam Castle, although many people don't realise this because it wasn't filmed there and there's no explicit connection, and that is Universal Studios' 1941 classic The Wolfman, starring Lon Chaney Jr. as Larry Talbot. And that name is a bit of a clue there. Larry Talbot, the man of Welsh ancestry who transforms into a wolf. And the reason the name Talbot is significant is because Margam Castle was built for the incredibly wealthy Talbert family, who brought work and industry to the area, and that is where the name Port Talbot comes from. It is the port of the Talbert family, and one member of the Talbot family crossed the Atlantic and became a werewolf. See, there's a nice link between Margam and Port Talbot and the Wolfman over in Hollywood. This is a Welsh werewolf in America, which would make a great sequel to An American Werewolf in London. And my last bit of movie trivia before we really get into the ghost stories, but when they remade The Wolfman in 2010, the Wolfman's father, Sir John Talbot, was played by Sir Anthony Hopkins, who is not only Welsh, but was born in Port Talbot, and more specifically, was born in Margam itself. And if that isn't a spooky coincidence, I don't know what is. The Wolfman hails from Margam, and years later, his father was played by probably the most famous person to come out of Margam, Sir Anthony Hopkins. Now, back to the history and back to the ghosts, because Margam Castle stands on sacred ground, which some people believe explains all of the ghostly activity. I mean, you can trace its history back through the centuries, and it was once a part of the vast Margam Abbey. In fact, the castle was at one point called Margam Abbey, and this abbey really was a huge, sprawling Cistercian monastery, much bigger than the size of the park nowadays. And it was founded in 1147. And what's important here, and important for future episodes of this podcast, is that Margam Abbey covered much more ground than the current Margam Park. Margam Park is a big chunk of land, but much more of the surrounding area, which takes in the nearby steelworks and houses and roads and all these other things, were once a part of this abbey land. And the reason this is important is that the most numerous ghost sightings in this part of the world, in the park and outside the park, are ghostly monks, and they are all believed to be associated with the monastery. And that is why at first the connection might not be that obvious. If somebody has built a big huge steelworks somewhere, you don't immediately associate it with a holy site. The same with residential buildings that are much more recent looking, but nevertheless, these buildings have been built on what was once sacred ground, on the grounds of this monastery. And that is why these ghostly monks are not constrained to what remains of the monastery now in a much smaller patch of land. These monks pop up all over the place. And this Christian connection, this really long-running Christian connection with the land, really does go deep. Celtic crosses and stones have been found all over the place, and you can see them on display in the Margam Stones museum, and you just know anywhere that's got its own stones museum must have some pretty impressive stones. Margam Stone Museum, just next door to the park, and these stones go all the way back to the early days of Christianity. And there is one place in particular, one place of Christian worship, where people regularly see these ghostly monks, and you don't even need to enter the park to see it. You can see it from outside. People see it when they finish work at the steelworks. People see it as they drive down the M4 motorway at night. And that is a procession of ghostly monks walking along the side of the mountain that overlooks Margam Park, above which is a little remote chapel called Capel Mair ar y Bryn, the Chapel of St. Mary on the Hill. So you don't even need to visit the park to catch a glimpse of these ghostly monks. You could be just driving down the motorway late at night, and if you look up at the mountainside, you might see those monks gliding along towards their place of worship. And another popular spot to encounter these ghostly monks, it would appear, and not just at a distance, but right up close, face to face, is said to be Talbert Steelworks, just a few minutes away. Now, I'm not going to go into this in too much detail now, because I will be recording an entire episode all about Talbert Steelworks, possibly even the next episode. I haven't quite planned out what I'm doing yet, but there will be an entire episode coming up all about the ghosts at Talbert Steelworks, many of which we believe are these ghostly monks. And yet another place to see them, this time back on the grounds of Margam Park. And one person who did go in search of these monks, possibly my favourite ghost hunter ever, somebody I've name-dropped many, many times on this podcast, and that is good old Peter Underwood, who, in the 1970s, visited Margam and wrote that the place is full of psychic power and undoubtedly, in my opinion, a very haunted spot. So, as far as one of Britain's leading ghost hunters was concerned, Margam is a place full of psychic power and undoubtedly, in my opinion, a very haunted spot. And he noted that the visitors there were encountering these ethereal monks not in the nighttime, but in the daytime. So in the grounds of the park, there are remains of the monastery there. You can walk amongst them. You can touch a lot of them. That is where, in the daytime, visitors were, in the 1970s at least, encountering these ghostly monks. And that taps into something that I'm not going to go off on a rant or anything on this Halloween episode, but this is something I'm quite passionate about and I've spoken about before. But if anyone is listening to this episode and thinking, do you know what? I'd love to go looking for ghosts in Margam Park, or even just soak up some of that psychic power that Peter Underwood was talking about. Well, just like he did, just like he recommends, you can just go there in the daytime, which, at the time of recording this, is 100% free. Entry to the park costs you nothing. You'll have to pay petrol and parking and things, of course, to get there, but entry to the park itself is free. And I meet so many people who tell me they'd love to go out ghost hunting, but they haven't got the right equipment, they haven't got the right tools, they can't afford these expensive overnight stays. And I've said it before, and I'll say it again, and you don't need any of it. You don't need to be a millionaire to go ghost hunting. You don't need all the fancy equipment. You don't need to spend lots and lots of money on commercial events if you can't afford it. Just turn up in the daytime, because that is when, remember, Peter Underwood is telling us people are seeing these ghostly monks. There's no point walking around in the dark. People are seeing them in the daytime. And worst case scenario, even if nothing spooky happens, at least you have a nice day out admiring the architecture and the gardens and whatever else you want to look at in Margam or wherever it is you decide to visit. Anyway, mini rant over. Let's get back to the ghosts of Margam. And we've looked at these ghostly monks who can be found outside the castle. But what if we head inside the castle, the centerpiece of the park, which, despite the name, is not really a castle. This is what rich people did back in the day. They'd build big fancy houses and call them castles, even though it was never built, to the best of my knowledge at least, to repel invading armies or to do any of that Lord of the Rings type stuff that people associate with castles nowadays. This house was built as a show of wealth, a show of power of the owner, a certain Christopher Rice Mansell Talbot, the name Talbot there, in 1840, so nearly 200 years ago now. Christopher Rice Mansell Talbot built this Gothic revival masterpiece on land that was bought by Sir Rice Mansell, whose descendants married into the Talbert family, so that's how it became Talbot land, and nowadays it's cared for by the council, but back in the day it was built for the Talbert family, which may or may not explain some of the ghostly goings-on inside. Now, the most regularly cited spirit inside the property is a good old White Lady ghost, a classic woman in white, or Lady Wen, as she was known by the Welsh-speaking locals, Lady Wen, White Lady, which is very, very appropriate for Halloween, or Nos Calan Gaeaf, as October the 31st is known in Wales, because that is when the Lady Wen, or to give her her full name, Lady Wen Heb Pen, the White Lady without a head, makes an appearance. And going off on a quick Halloween tangent, but it is said that if you encounter this Lady Wen Heb Pen, this White Lady without a head, not to be confused with the Margam Park White Lady, this White Lady without a head can be encountered anywhere in Wales, maybe anywhere in the world. If you see a White Lady ghost out and about on October the 31st, she is said to act like some kind of death omen, and that might be a sign that you will not be on this earth much longer, that this might well be your last Halloween, and if not you, somebody very near to you. So you have been warned. If you are out and about after dark on October the 31st, you really need to try and avoid this White Lady ghost, and the best way to do that is to avoid crossroads, because crossroads are her favourite places. But never mind that White Lady for now, because we've also got an other White Lady to worry about. Let's go back to the White Lady of Margam, and she is most often seen swooping down what is probably the most photogenic part of the interior of the building, and that is the grand staircase. And it really is grand. Grand is a very apt word here, because as soon as you walk through the entrance doors, which themselves are quite impressive, there it is, and you just think, wow, you know, if I was a ghost, if I was a White Lady, this is the stairs I'd want to be haunting. It really is. Words don't do it justice. You'll have to go, well, you can check my YouTube video, or you can do a quick internet search to have a look at these stairs. But who is this White Lady? Well, as with most White Lady ghosts, nobody really knows, but they do tend to become associated with one of the more famous ladies who lived at the property. That's why there's so many White Lady queens and princesses and things haunting all these historic properties. Let's find a famous person and pin it on them. And in this case, the leading theory is that this White Lady is Emily Charlotte Talbot. Again, we've got the Talbot surname. And she was, following the tragic death of her brother, of Talbot's son, she became the heiress and inherited the Talbert family fortune. So she became one of the wealthiest women in Britain when she inherited that money. And much like her father, of course, she lived the good life. I mean, she was living in Margam Castle. She was obviously living in some luxury, but she did also improve the lives and change the fortunes of the people in the local area. She very much put her stamp on the park and on Port Talbot itself. And when she died in 1918, she was buried in Margam in the family vault. And the Margam Abbey church, which is within the grounds of Margam Park, is fully functional and still going strong today. You can pop in for prayer and worship if you are religious. If not, you can just admire the artistic treasures inside. There are some wonderful pre-Raphaelite starlight windows in there, but you want to hear ghost stories, not the art history of Margam, so back to the ghosts. And while the White Lady might be the most famous, commonly cited ghost inside the castle at least, she is by far not the only one, and the ghosts of children dressed in Victorian clothing have also been seen and heard and felt inside. These children are believed to be playful and in high spirits, so they are little rich Victorian children running around, playing games by the sounds of it, making noises and brushing against people as they go from room to room. And that is why people get this sensation when, if they are also maybe having a tour of the house and they are walking from room to room, they might feel like these ghostly figures are following them. And that's because they are also running around the rooms, brushing back and forth against their legs and against their hands. And maybe, I'm this is all hypothetical, I'm thinking aloud here, maybe these children are not in any way doing it intentionally. Maybe they're just playing as they did in life, totally oblivious to the fact that they now have these other people walking around among them, just as we maybe can't see them, but we get this sensation that there is something going on. I don't know, but that is one of the explanations to explain these sensations, that maybe there are ghostly children running around inside the house. And finally, there are many more figures that have been sighted inside the castle. We'd be here all day talking about each and every one of them. But the last one of note that I'd like to mention is said to be a man dressed in Victorian clothing. Again, Victorian ghosts are very popular with this place. And this one is described as a more reserved gentleman. So this man would certainly not be running around brushing against you. And he may or may not have some connection with the children. So I get the impression people have encountered them at roughly the same time. In which case, is he there looking for the children, looking after the children, looking for the children? Maybe he's lost them. I don't know. Again, all hypothetical. I'm thinking aloud. And there are some guesses as to who this might be. Maybe it's one of the Talbert family. Maybe it's one of the working staff. But whoever it is, a man, a reserved gentleman in Victorian clothing has also been seen inside. Now, these are all the classic ghosts that have been associated with the castle and the grounds for decades, if not centuries, in the cases of the monks. But something happened in the 1990s that changed things. And this might be very familiar to seasoned paranormal investigators. Because in 1977, Margam Castle caught fire. And the damage was pretty devastating. The restoration work is still going on today. Nearly 50 years later, work is still going on trying to repair Margam Castle. And 1995 is a key year, because extensive renovation work was carried out. And some people might say this was the cause of what followed. It's certainly an idea. But as a result, after that renovation work, there was supposedly a huge spike in paranormal activity at Margam Castle. So 1995 was something of a turning point, because before then, people spoke of ghostly monks and white ladies. But after 1995, things got a bit more serious. And one theory was that by reopening these locked rooms and places that kept their memories inside, maybe, just maybe, they had disturbed something that had been sitting there, lurking there quietly all this time, and did this in some way unleash spirits that were happily minding their own business, but now they'd been disturbed, they were going to make their presence known. And in one account, 2 members of kitchen staff working there supposedly refused to work anymore afterwards because something was violently hissing at them. Something was violently hissing at them, and they believed this was directly related to the renovation work that had just taken place. All of which brings us nicely to what is said to be the angriest entity of all, and certainly the most well-known spirit haunting outside of the castle. We've got the White Lady dominating inside, but outside, the most fearsome spirit is a gamekeeper called Robert Scott. And I do want to stress at this point, and it's worth remembering that these spooky ghost stories and these podcasts and all the rest of it, they're all well and good. But Scott was a very real person, and he was killed while he was just doing his job in Margam. In fact, his grave can be visited today. You can pop, if you go to Margam, go and pay your respects at his grave, which is in the graveyard adjoining the church I mentioned earlier. And unlike the White Lady, where there is a little bit of ambiguity as to who exactly this is, there are theories. The most popular one is that it's Emily Talbot. But unlike the White Lady, in this case, we do have a specific name. This is a very specific person. It is Robert Scott, who was killed in 1898 when he was 39 years old. And according to the newspaper reports, the Talbert family had asked him at the time to keep an eye out for and to catch poachers who were on their land, and it was while he was on patrol one night with two other people, with another employee called Robert Kidd and the private constable P.C. Horton. So he had the police with him. They did come across a man acting suspiciously, we can assume to be a poacher, and they decided to split up and to circle around the suspect in a pincer movement. So all three of them split up and circled around, and it was while they were separated that Scott was the first person to come across this poacher, and as a result, he was shot. In fact, he was shot twice by the poacher, first in the face and then in the body. And his lifeless corpse wasn't discovered until the next day when they found him lying in a gully. And that gully, the location of his body, became something of a macabre tourist attraction, a bit like dark tourism today, but people flocked to that location to see where the deed had taken place. Thousands of people, it was said, thousands of people visited that grisly crime scene. So this isn't only a modern thing, people travelling far and wide to go and see these scenes. People were travelling in their thousands to visit this site, and on the day of his funeral, soon afterwards, work did stop at Margam Castle to allow all of the staff to go and attend, and it was said that around 800 mourners, which is a massive amount for any funeral, never mind a humble gamekeeper, a working class man, 800 mourners lined the way to his final resting place, that short journey down the road to Margam's Abbey Church. Nowadays, if the ghost stories are true, Scott still makes his presence known, primarily outside, stomping around the grounds. So if you do hear some strange sounds in the grounds themselves, maybe that's his angry spirit, understandably angry spirit, letting off some steam. He's also been blamed for slamming some doors downstairs, some of the outer buildings, but primarily he is a ghost encountered outside on the grounds, which just goes to show that wherever you are in this park, inside the castle, you've got the White Lady and the children. Outside, you've got the monks and the gamekeeper. Wherever you turn, there is a ghostly someone or something just waiting to be encountered. Now, that brings me to the end of the classic ghost stories associated with Margam Park. There are many more, but they are the famous ones. They are the classic ghost stories. But before I wrap up this episode, I did want to talk quickly about the Halloween Fright Nights event at Margam and some of the videos I've been recording, because the vast majority of people who listen to this podcast tune in on Spotify and Apple and all of those big providers. But you can also listen on YouTube, and those lovely people who do subscribe on YouTube have recently had some nice surprises. Oh, I hope they're nice. They've had some surprises, because I've started uploading some little video bits and bobs, including a full walkthrough of Fright Nights at Margam Park. So if you're interested, you can go and watch the whole thing. But generally, my quick review is that I do think they did a fantastic job overall. There are some little quibbles I did point out at the end, but fingers crossed, I do hope it gets bigger and better over the coming years. I was a little bit lucky when I visited, because I was there for the first night ever. It was the press night before it opened to the public, and on the one hand, that was great. It made filming much easier, not having so many people around and things. I guess the downside is that this thing is being tweaked as they go along, so I imagine it's getting better and better night by night, and it would be nice to pop back and see what it's like at the end of the run, maybe. And I've also got another Margam video on the way very soon, and this one, I really enjoyed making this one. It was a bit unexpected, but one thing I haven't mentioned about Margam yet is that there are so many hardworking volunteers there who keep that place going, keep that that place looking great and keep it open to the public. It really does rely on the volunteers, and some of them do have some fantastic ghost stories of their own. One of them did take me to some of the areas which are slightly off limits to the public, although I'm sure if you ask some people nicely you can probably find a way. But I was taken to these rooms, told these tales, shown the evidence where possible. There's one incredibly creepy one about this child's cot that was hurled against the wall, which is still there, although sadly it has been damaged by, I believe, one of the commercial groups using the place. But nevertheless, that is all on video, and that is on its way to my YouTube channel this spooky season. So if you haven't already, now is the time to go over and subscribe to that as well. Unless, of course, you are one of those people who listens on YouTube anyway, in which case, well done you. Give yourself a pat on the back. All of which brings me to the end of another episode of the Ghosts and Folklore podcast, the Halloween episode, Nos Calan Gaeaf episode of the Ghosts and Folklore podcast. If you enjoyed this episode and you haven't already, as I've just been shamelessly plugging away, but please consider pressing the subscribe button wherever you are listening, but also including YouTube. And if you really enjoyed it, you can support the podcast by giving it a nice review or rating and telling your friends about it. And if you really want to support the podcast, you can treat me to a coffee via my website, which Halloween is looming. It will definitely be a pumpkin spice until the shops stop selling it, which, knowing my luck, will be November the 1st. But for as long as I can get it, those coffees that you treat me to will be pumpkin spiced. If you'd like more ghosts and folklore, you can follow me on social media. And as well as this podcast, I've also written a number of books about similar weird and wonderful subjects, which are available from all good bookshops, offline and on. And on that note, it just leaves me to say thank you very much for listening. Diolch yn fawr iawn am wrando. I've been Mark Rees. This has been my Ghosts and Folklore podcast, beaming to you from Wales to the world. And remember, you don't need to be a millionaire to go ghost hunting on Halloween or any other day of the year. All you need is an open mind, a warm coat, a flask of coffee, and if you encounter a white lady, just hope she's got a head. Until next time, Nos da.